All right, it's a very good day for our rand. We'll get to the reasons why, but first let's start in Asia, where the markets closed first. Hong Kong's shares surged more than 4% today ahead of the government's formal withdrawal of the proposed extradition bill. That's what's seen protests across Hong Kong. The bill sparked 3 months of protests in the former British colony. China stocks taking its cue from the sharper gains in Hong Kong as well. Well, U.S. stocks fell on Tuesday. They are only getting traction today. Investors were worried yesterday about global growth prospects after data showed U.S. factory activity shrank in August for the first time since 2016. The U.S. and China also imposed new tariffs on each other over the weekend, so the trade spat continues. The Dow Jones down by more than 8%, the S&P 500 down by nearly 0.7%, the Nasdaq down by 1% as well. The JSE a little bit higher, but the rand hitting a 3-week high today, and it's quite strong after that glowing GDP data for the second quarter came out yesterday. Also seemingly buoyed by what's happening in Hong Kong, leading to a glow across emerging markets today, bringing back some investors in so-called riskier currencies like the Turkish lira and like our own rand. Let's take a look at your main financial indicators. All right, let's get some more on the markets now. We cross to Arabile Gumede, who is at the World Economic Forum on Africa in Cape Town. So Arabile, I don't know if you have all the numbers at your fingertips today, but it's a great day for the rand.
Yeah, well, good afternoon. We are, of course, joining you live from the CTICC here in Cape Town, of course, for the WEF Africa 2019 happening right here in Cape Town. Indeed, it is a discussion point across Africa as to how exactly we will be able to advance the fourth industrial revolution, and that discussion continues to be one that South Africa and the rest of the continent will certainly have. A very quick look at the markets as well at this point in time, and certainly just looking at the rand as well, which is headed to a 3-week high today, rallying, of course, off that 3.1% boost when it comes to GDP data for South Africa for the second quarter. A massive unexpected jump there as well, from the expected 2.5% that we expected to see come off for the second quarter of the year. But just how significant and how important will that be to the rest of the year? Certainly going to be quite interesting for South Africa's growth, which is mooted to be around 0.6% or so for this year, according to the South African Reserve Bank's estimate. But let's unpack just a little bit more with regards to not just this market and how it's sitting, which is currently flat at present, but certainly just around the World Economic Forum and its play with regards to South Africa's investment opportunities and how significant it is. We are joined then live here by Dr. Arabile Gumede, independent economist, joining us as well as we unpack it. Tabi, thank you so much for the time. Appreciate it. The significance of WEF cannot be outplayed, no matter how many times we call it a workshop.
Definitely. So the World Economic Forum, and especially the topic that we're dealing with now, that is the Africa Free Trade Agreement, they're a very significant topic for the continent, having signed the free trade agreement by a few of the African, at least most of the African countries. And so the topic is relevant, but WEF is significant as a platform for African business people and leaders to come together to discuss various topics every 2 years on the African continent.
And considering that the rest of the world is going through, of course, a huge trade spat, whichever way you look, of course, the the primary one will be China and the United States. How significant will that discussion be in and around the conversations here at WEF for the next few days?
I think the spat between the US and China and its impact on South Africa and on the continent is quite clear that South Africa and the continent needs to focus on the intra-Africa trade so that we don't become victims of two countries fighting each other. So far we've seen pull-out or outflows in our bond and equity markets as a result of the spat between the two countries. But also, we've seen African countries being impacted by the spat as well. The fact that the Chinese economy is also being battered, that means also that their outlook on the continent and their future investment on the continent may be impacted by what is going on between the US and China.
Are we worried at all, considering the current sort of turmoil that is happening in the country, and whether that puts a dampener on the focus as well, also required for South Africa's economic woes?
I think we need to put what is happening in South Africa in context. South Africa is not a country that is not violent free. We do have outbreaks of violence, unfortunately. And this violence is not just directed towards a certain group of people, it's directed towards everyone, especially women, especially children, especially the elderly and vulnerable. So when we do talk about the violence that has erupted, we need to also be aware of not excluding certain people who are affected. So let's take, for example, this week alone, there were more South African women, children who were killed by South Africans than any other group of people outside of South Africa who reside in South Africa. But having said that, it is inexcusable that anyone is attacked, especially foreign citizens in South Africa, and obviously that will have a negative impact on our economy and also on our companies that are invested in the rest of the continent. I think it's also time where leadership needs to take a stand and actually be vocal about what is happening, and also because the theme is Africa connectivity via trade. It's also, you can't connect via trade without communicating, and I think that that should be the basis of our interaction and engagement with the rest of the continent. We have a common understanding of all our difficulties on the continent, and also a common purpose to merge and help each other deal with the difficulties that each and every country faces on the continent.
So we get GDP number of 3.1% for the second quarter. Does that really change things for the year? Is it still one where you see a dire situation, or does it perhaps begin to say then we may have reached the trough and now we're perhaps going into a little bit of an upswing?
So with the absence of economic direction, I don't expect this year to see an increase or improvement in the GDP numbers that I've had and many analysts have had. So GDP, I expect GDP to be around 0.6%. I don't see it going much beyond 0.8%. So it's still below 1%. And again, just perspective, one swallow doesn't make a spring or a summer. If you look at South Africa's GDP growth in the past 10 years, it hasn't, on average, grown above 2%. So the 3.2% or 3.1% that we saw yesterday is not reassuring, or is not a sign that we are on our way to recovery. It is led by base effects and a normalization in the electricity production that was disturbed and interrupted by load shedding in the first quarter.
Key messages then to kind of close off out of WEF that you're expecting to hear, that you would like to hear, to say at least then we came out of this WEF forum with something?
I'd like the next WEF, because the only way you can measure the success is to look at it in 2 years' time. And I'd like in 2 years' time for us to speak about intra-Africa trade that is closer to 20% than what we currently have. So we need to put our words into action. And I think often we find ourselves in these forums where we talk a lot and we listen to incredible speakers, knowledgeable speakers, and yet we don't see that translate on the ground. So I'd like to see growth on the ground, and I'd like to see the Africa Free Trade Agreement come to action.
Tabi, always great chatting to you. Thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. That's Dr. Tabi Leoka there, helping us unpack perhaps some key thoughts, some key elements with regards to South Africa's growth picture. Also, the World Economic Forum, just how important and significant it will be to South Africa's continued discussions around the continent. Getting that African Continental Free Trade Agreement up and running. And yes, it has been signed and ratified by a whole host of countries across the continent, but now putting it into action is certainly going to be quite key. Of course, we saw the economic plan come out of the finance minister's office as well just last week. How important is that then as we head into hopefully a time when South Africa can look to recover? And also dealing with issues, of course, of women abuse as well is going to be quite significant, because that tells you the story of where we can be as a society and where we should be as a society. Certainly not a picture we want to share with the rest of the world. We'll take an ad break now. We will come back to you with a little more news, and of course we'll continue to cover the World Economic Forum in Africa 2019.